Welcome everybody to the presentation on the MCAT. We're going to go through a presentation about the MCAT 2015, which is obviously the new version of the MCAT. The old version is no longer being offered as a test, but it is being accepted by schools for the next probably couple of years. Some schools are accepting it for 2 years, some are accepting it for 3 years. So I just like to start out by reminding everybody, nobody gets excited when they're thinking about studying for the MCAT. I know it's not the most exciting thing to do. It's a lot of work, and especially if you're working full time and then coming home and studying, it can be kind of stressful. All your friends are going off, they're having fun, they're going out after work, and you're back in the library. But keep the ultimate goal in mind as you're going through the process. Dr. Begley put this image in here, this thought in here. Close your eyes and picture the MCAT as visual. What do you see? If you open your eyes, well, I guess if you're on the phone, you can't see this, but I don't know if this is what anybody else came up with. This is what some people may think of when they think of the MCAT exam, but we really want to change the way that you're thinking of the MCAT exam. The MCAT is really a first step in the start of your professional journey. As you go through medical school, you'll start hearing a lot about your professional responsibility to your patients and your future patients. This is your first step in that responsibility to those future patients who you're taking care of. So try and think of it as a part of your professional journey as you're studying for it. You really want to make sure that you're studying for it sufficiently and not just thinking, okay, well, this is the minimum I have to get. You really want to do your best on this exam for a lot of different reasons. You want to be able to get into your top choice schools, and your top choice schools really can vary because when you apply, you're going to be matching up who you are with the mission of the school. And some people, that may mean, you're not really interested in going to an Ivy school or a school that requires a super high MCAT. But it doesn't hurt to have a high MCAT. It really leaves those options open. And another thing that it can do for you is it can help you get an earlier acceptance. So the extra 2 months that you put into studying for the MCAT exam, if it leads to acceptance 2 months earlier in the application cycle, it is so worth it. And getting that early acceptance and that earlier, yes, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be going to medical school next year, is such a relief and is such a great feeling. It's really worth putting that time in on the front end. And the other thing that I'm sure you guys know, but you have to remind yourself, unlike the SAT, which is general knowledge, all of the stuff that you learn on the MCAT is really the foundations of what you'll be learning in medical school. So all of this information that you're learning is going to help you with your medical school program. So it's stuff that you're going to need to know to be successful in medical school. Course content is listed here. Biochemistry is definitely covered on the new MCAT exam, and I've heard there's a fair amount of biochemistry on it. You need to take genetics at Northeastern to take biochemistry. If you're taking it someplace else, you may not need to take genetics. It's not a bad idea to have genetics. It's pretty important for medicine. Psychology and sociology are covered on the behavioral health section of the MCAT. You're not necessarily required to take those courses for applying, but if you don't take the classes, don't underestimate the amount of time you need to spend studying on that section. You really do need to get a high quality score, and it's a fairly large field, the psychology sociology field. So you really want to make sure if you're studying it yourself that you set aside enough time to really do a thorough job of studying. As you're getting started, we definitely recommend looking through anything that AAMC puts out as your first resource. They write the test, and so they know what's on it, and they're going to have the best perspective of what's on it. They're also a nonprofit, so their resources are going to be the least expensive. The AAMC official guide is really useful. There's a lot of information on their websites. Start putting together folders for all of the different sections. Hopefully you have notes from all of your classes, from when you took organic, from when you took general bio. You definitely want to be doing practice reading from complex material. The Economist, the New York Times, journals that aren't science journals. When you're reading from things like the New York Times, don't just go to the science section. Read from things like the art section, humanities related sections. So you want to be reading things that are similar to what you'll be reading, the passages that you're reading on the exam. And remember, the classes that you took at Northeastern are not MCAT prep classes, so you may still need to be learning additional material. So there may be some units that are on the MCAT exam that you haven't covered, and you'll need to do some self-studying on, some biology, some chemistry, some biochemistry. So you really want to do a thorough overview of what's on the test. And AAMC does have a what's on the test section, and you can also get some of the books that are out there that talk about what's on the test. So you really want to do a review of all of the course content, and then you want to do a lot of practice questions. You also want to make sure to do practice tests. It's a really long exam. It's 6 hours and 15 minutes of seat time, plus additional time for the breaks. And when you take the actual test, you'll have to fill out the agreements and all of that. So it's really important to get practice with the timing of the test and the duration of the test. On the actual test day, you don't want to be exhausted when you get to the behavioral health section and do worse on it just because you're mentally exhausted. So it's important to do those practice tests and do a fair number of them. AAMC has a limited number of them, so you do have to get practice tests from someplace else, like a test prep company. I recommend when you're doing the practice tests, you're probably going to do it on a Saturday or a Sunday. If you're working, you'll get up the same time that you would get up for taking the test on the actual test day. Have the same breakfast that you're going to have, something that's going to be calming for your stomach. Take the test at 8 o'clock, just like you would on the test day. Take the breaks. So you're really using that practice test as a way to get into the practice of what it will be like on the test day. Obviously, it's not going to be exactly the same, but if you can do it in the practice sessions and get good scores on the actual test day, if you're feeling nervous about it, you can kind of talk yourself through it and remind yourself, I've done this before. I've done it just like this. It's always been fine. I know this is nerve-wracking, but I've had positive results with this before. I can do this. You really want to set up a study plan. Start with a self-assessment to see what you need to study the most, and you want to focus on the weakest areas first. You don't want that big area that you know nothing about hanging over your head. You'll come back to your weakest area later and be like, okay, I can go over this again. You want to put together a realistic study schedule for yourself. If you're working full time, don't think that you're going to come home every day and study for 3 hours. Give yourself maybe 4 days a week you'll study, but give yourself a night off. Realize that, it will take 7 hours on a weekend day if you're doing a practice test. So that's going to take up a big chunk of your time. So you want to be realistic about how much time you're going to have and then plan the duration of your studying based on that. So if you're only studying 10 hours a week, you're going to need to do that for longer than if you're studying for 20 hours a week. You want to study from all the sections. Sometimes people will realize, okay, biology is my weakest section. I really need to focus on this, and they'll neglect the other sections, and they'll pull up their biology score a lot, which is great, but then they'll, neglect the critical reasoning section and do worse on that, even though that was initially their strongest section. So make sure you're studying in all of the different sections, and group studying can be really great. Studying with a group helps to keep you accountable, and it really helps to keep you on track with your schedule, with your studying. Make sure you're studying with a group that's as dedicated as you are, and is going to really be studying and be really focused and not be socializing too much during that study time. In terms of test prep classes, should you take one, shouldn't you take one? That's really an individual decision. AAMC or MCAT data shows that about 50% of matriculated students do wind up taking a test prep class. It does provide good structure, organization. They do have a lot of resources. There's no one best company. There's Kaplan, there's Princeton, there's Exam Crackers. There's a number of companies out there. The classes are expensive, and so you really have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of taking a class. In the, ultimate end of becoming a physician, the cost of a test prep class is probably just a drop in the bucket. However, in this particular moment right now, it's a pretty large expense. So you really have to consider, do I have this money? If I spend this money, am I going to have enough money to pay for my secondaries, to pay potentially to travel to interviews, because that can also really add up to a lot of money. So you really want to do a look at your finances. I think you also want to consider your own study strategy and your own, study tendencies. If you're somebody who procrastinates and really needs somebody to help you to organize things and keep on top of things, a test prep class is a good way to do that. If you feel like I can organize myself and sit down and do the studying, you may not need one. And a lot of people study on their own and are quite successful without a test prep class. Test prep companies will tell you, oh, you have to get this or get that. Be a really informed consumer. They are not nonprofits. They're, yes, they want you to do well on the test, but they're also they're thinking about their bottom line. So they are looking to create a profit. So definitely always weigh the pros and cons of everything that you purchase in terms of test prep materials. Next question is, when should I take the test? Hopefully, if you guys are planning to apply for this year, you've already registered for the tests. The April and May tests the registration has already opened. If you haven't registered for it yet, you should really consider registering pretty much ASAP. A lot of the seats are filling up, and once the seats locally fill up, the Boston seats do fill up faster just because there are so many students in the Boston area. You may have to travel to take the test, and most people really don't want to do that. You really want to make sure that you're taking the test when you're ready to achieve your best score. So as you're getting closer to your test date, if you start to think, you know what, I'm not completely ready to take this test, it's a good idea to delay or change your test date. If you feel like, you know what, this isn't going to be a good test, I need another couple weeks, I need another month to study, it's better to delay your test than take it and get a bad score. Those scores don't go away, as we obviously know. It can be a little bit tricky to reschedule, but if you decide you want to reschedule, you won't be the only one deciding to reschedule. So if you're like, I really need to push this off, I signed up for the April 1st test, but I think that I need a little bit more time. I want to take the May 6th one. You can check in on the May 6th dates and just keep checking. Eventually people do change their mind, or they decide, what am I thinking? I'm not taking the MCAT. So seats do open up. It's, at random times. You just have to keep checking in. So MCAT tests are normalized after the test, which in the long run is better in terms of scoring. It means that if a test is harder, you don't wind up sort of being penalized for just happening to take the test on the day that the test is harder. In the short term, though, it can be really painful because it does take a month to get your score. So you do have to sort of plan that month that it takes for you to get the test into when you take it. Obviously, as we know, our goal is always to apply early. The applications become available in the beginning of May. For MD programs, you can typically submit them in the beginning of June. Last year, it was like June 2nd. For DO programs, last year they sort of surprised us and they opened them in May, and you could submit them right away. The applications for the DO programs were sent out to the schools on June 15th, which was a bit earlier than we were anticipating. So if you take your tests and aren't getting your score back until June 14th, your score, in terms of when your application will go to the school, you have to do a little strategic planning. For the MD programs, the way that they have traditionally released the applications to the schools is they've traditionally released them on the third or the fourth Thursday of the month of June, which this year is June 25th. So you really want your application ready to go to the schools around then. So if you take the April tests, either one of those April tests, your scores will be ready. You'll have your score in time for, to apply in the beginning of May or in the beginning of June, to submit your application in the beginning of June for the MD programs. For the DO programs, they say it takes less than 4 weeks for your application to be verified. So, the first test will definitely work out. The second test should pretty much work out too. In terms of the May test dates, the May 6th date, if you're not graduating, obviously, if you are graduating, you're probably not going to want to take a test on graduation day. I think that would be a kind of sad way to spend your graduation, taking a 6-hour and 15-minute test, although it's your decision. So there's May 6th, there's the 14th or the 20th. So there are a few things to think about in terms of these test dates. The way that the application process works, when you put together your application, on your application, you write all of your grades, and then you also send in a copy of your transcript, and somebody at the application processing service looks at what you've written and at your official transcript and checks them to make sure it's correct. That is called verification, and that verification process takes a little bit of time. So that's the thing that takes a little bit of time in the processing of the applications. That's why for the MD programs, for example, the first day to submit applications is usually right around June 2nd, and the first day that schools get the application isn't for another 4 weeks, because they want to have enough applications verified, and they want to spend 4 weeks verifying those applications. Now, if you submit your application in that first week, if you submit your application on June 7th, right after getting your MCAT score, odds are really strong that your application will be verified on June 25th or whatever day they send out your application. When you get to, June 14th and June 21st to have your application verified, it's a little less sure if it's going to be verified on June 25th. For the 14th, it could be. That's a little tight, and obviously for the 21st, it's probably not going to be. It gets to a point where it's taking 4 to 6 weeks for applications to be verified. One thing that you can decide to do after you take your MCAT, if you feel pretty good about it, you can submit your application and just apply to one school. So if you submit your application and apply to one school, you get that verification process started so that when you get your MCAT score, if you're happy with your MCAT score, you can just add all the other schools. It doesn't take any time to do that. And then your application can go out to all of the schools on that first release day, which is whatever, June 25th or so. There's a little bit of a risk to this because if you don't get a score that you like, you're going to withdraw your application, right? Because you're not going to apply with a score that you're not feeling good about. You lose the money that you spent on that first application, a couple $100, which for some people is a big deal and for some people is less of a big deal. And also the school that you applied to is going to see your application with the score. They're going to see that you withdrew it. So, you don't necessarily want your name out there with a score that you don't want them to see. Usually people will apply to a lower choice school so that, they're not sending out their application to a top choice school with a score that they don't want. So that is something that you can decide to do. You can also decide, well, I'm just going to wait until I get my score on June 21st and have your application verified. The schools will be able to see that you've applied, they just won't see your GPA. Most of the schools will still send you secondary applications at that point. Additional test dates that you can take the MCAT and still get a committee letter are the June dates. You have to apply by July 31st with a MCAT score if you want a committee letter. If you apply after that, you get a letter packet. So registration has already started for January, May, and June, and I guess April also. Definitely April. July registration dates have, like this, the start date to register has not been announced yet. Remember, change your date if you are not ready to take the test. Make sure that when you register for the test, your name is exactly as it appears on your government ID that you're going to bring with you on the test date. So if you have two last names, make sure that you register with two last names. If you go by your middle name and your first name is on the ID, use your first name, etc. AAMC policy is that they do limit the number of times you can take the test. I hope that nobody is planning to take the test 3 times in the year or 7 times. That's a lot of times to take the MCAT. The pre-health advising programs policy is that you can only take it once in the calendar year. If you would like to request an exception, either talk to Dr. Begley or myself. We don't create that policy to drive you crazy or to penalize people if they get a bad score. The reason we have it is to help prevent people from making a mistake. So if you get a bad score in April, typically that means you need to study for several more months. So you need to be studying for another 4 or so months to really get a good score. So if you turn around and take it again in May, the odds of you getting a second bad score are pretty good. So what we want to make sure of is that you don't compound that bad score by getting another bad score. Now, sometimes there are times when you get a bad score and there's a reason that you got a bad score. You were sick during the test, you couldn't sleep the night before, something happened that caused you to get a bad score. It wasn't because you weren't prepared for it. So in that case, you can take it a second time, but you really want to talk to us before that. And with the test day, make sure you know where you're going, make sure you know if you're driving there, where you're going to park, try and get a good night's sleep. If you're using public transportation, make sure you know the bus schedule. You may want to even consider, if you're not driving, taking an Uber, just in case, the train gets stuck. I mean, that would be a really bad thing to have happen. So it may be worth investing the extra money for the peace of mind. make sure to allow extra time, have breakfast, try and do whatever you do to get sort of in your happy place mentally. Remember to bring your government ID with a picture. I've heard of people being asked for a second photo ID, so it's a good idea just to bring a couple photo IDs with you. Prepare mentally for the test day. Remember, odds are really good that you're not going to get everything right. You're used to knowing almost all of the answers because you're used to doing really well on tests. And mentally, you have to know that that may not be the case here. That's in part where the practice tests come in. There may be distractions on the day of the test because it's a computer-based test. Everybody doesn't start at the same time. So what they do at the test center, they fingerprint everybody and they take their picture, and then you go in and you're assigned to your computer. And so people are coming in as they're fingerprinted. They walk in and they sit down at their computer and they start the test. So people are gradually trickling in. You'll hear people coming in, sitting down, starting their test. So there's going to be that sort of noise of people walking around. And then during the test, people have their breaks at different times. So you don't want to be distracted by people getting up and taking a break or thinking, oh my gosh, that person is already done, like some people do during tests. You're starting at different times, you're pausing at different times, you're leaving at different times. They do give you ear plugs at some of the tests. I think they give them at all of the test centers. So if you're easily distracted, you may want to consider wearing those. If that's something that you're planning on doing, you may want to wear them for some of your practice tests just to get used to them because they're a little awkward and uncomfortable at first. And then remember, you do have the option to void the test if you aren't feeling good about it. People are notoriously poor judges of how they're doing on the MCAT, but they're not that poor judges. So definitely a lot of people have told me that they voided their first test and then they realized I wasn't ready for this. So they voided it and they went back and they took it a second time. Reasons for voiding it, if you just know, oh, this was not good. Sometimes people, for whatever reason, their timing gets off and they have like a section or two sections or two passages that they didn't finish. And that's a good reason to say, okay, I didn't finish, 2/5 or 2/6 of this section. I'm not going to do well on it. I better just void it and plan to retake it. Nobody knows if you void it. We don't know. MCAT doesn't know. So it doesn't really count as taking the test because you voided it. So this is definitely an option. Obviously, nobody goes into the test to void it. But if you know that your performance on a section was not good, it's better to void it, take the hit to the wallet and the time, and go back and take it again. If you void it, you don't get your score, and that is kind of tough because sometimes, curiosity just sort of wins the day. If you don't get a good score, you can retake the exam if you took it in January and you want to take it again in April or May. Otherwise, we really typically recommend deferring for a year and spending more time studying. Like I said, we will talk to people. Sometimes something happened and it's not that you weren't ready to take it, it's just you weren't feeling well, etc. One poor score is not the end of the world. It is a really stressful test. Sometimes, after that first test, you kind of get your nerves and that piece under control and go back and do it again. It's more familiar, you know what to expect, and you can do better on it on the second time. And I've definitely seen students who have done that, or applicants who have done that. What we want to prevent is you taking it 2 times and both times not getting a score that you want, because that starts to establish a pattern. So you really want to be strategic and mindful and thoughtful in, if you don't get that first score in the area that you want, how are you going to change things for the next test? You really want to think about it and make sure that you have plan for a better score for the next time. So with a new score scale, we can compare the old score and the new score based on percentiles, and I'll show you that in the next couple of slides. What we don't know is how the admissions committees are going to be using the new scores, and unfortunately, we aren't really going to know that until probably August of next year. So we have some general ideas, but we're not completely sure. The way that the MCAT was put together, each section is scored from 118 to 132. The midpoint is 125. The midpoint of the overall exam is 500, and you'll get a percentile. And the way to match the old and the new is obviously with the percentiles. AAMC put together the new test with a 500 as the midpoint to try and encourage the schools to really look at applicants who have a 500 or higher as good applicants for medical schools. The data shows that an applicant who has a 500 and the MCAT and a GPA in the maybe 3.2 or so range who's accepted to medical school has about 97% chance of being academically successful in medical school, whereas somebody with like a 3.6 and a 30 on the MCAT has about a 98% chance of being academically successful. So there really isn't that huge of a difference. And that's why the AAMC is trying to get the schools to kind of look at a larger applicant pool. What we don't know is how the schools are going to change, or if they're going to change what they're doing with MCAT and how they're viewing those scores. So you can kind of see a comparison of the overall scores between old and new based on the percentiles. So with the old score, a 30 was kind of where you wanted to be for MD programs, which is about a 509, 508, 509 on the new test. A 32 was the median score for accepted students for MD programs, which is somewhere around a 512. And then if you're looking at, for example, Harvard's median score, accepted score, that was around a 36, which is a 518, which is pretty high. And then when you're looking at DO programs, they are really looking at around 27 as their median accepted score these days, which is around a 503. So even, the DO programs are definitely taking applicants who are in that 500 and better range. So they are definitely more holistic in their review, but, you want to have a strong MCAT score no matter where you're applying. And then when you start looking at the subsections, you can kind of see where those percentiles are. In the past, for most of the MD programs, you want to think about being at least at a 10 with your subsections, which is somewhere in the upper 70th percentile and the 80th percentile for the CARS section. So you really want to be thinking about pretty strong MCAT scores, and for the DO programs, again, still pretty strong numbers that you want to be putting forward for those. So that is a general overview about the MCAT. I don't know if anybody has questions for me, things that you're wondering about that I haven't covered. Anyone? Now is the time for questions. You can type those questions into the chat panel. I do have the volume muted now. So it seems like we don't have any questions right now. Definitely, if you do have questions, feel free to send me an email, set up an appointment time to come in and chat with me. Really spend a lot of time studying for this test. It's a very important test in that it will help you with your application, and it will really help you in your academic program in medical school. So thank you for coming, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you in the future. And for those of you online now, we will have foundation meetings coming up. At those, we're going to talk a little bit about school choice. So what things should you be thinking about when you're thinking about where to apply? And also a little bit about, we'll talk a little about what the application itself asks for. So I hope to see you guys then. Thanks so much.